I've been getting more and more into running, and if I had a moderately sized budget, it's the Garmin Forerunner 570 I would likely get. I've been using Garmin for all of my bike rides and runs, but they have their limitations, and today we'll do a systematic test of the Garmin Forerunner 570 that's completely data driven. We'll see how it compares to other devices in terms of its heart rate tracking performance for different exercises, its sleep stage tracking, and its GPS tracking. And we'll look at both running and cycling for GPS tracking. Now, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Rob and I'm a postdoctoral scientist specializing in biological data analysis, and it's also data analysis what we'll do with this watch, the Garmin Forerunner 570. Now, I've tested many Garmin devices over time and I really like the Forerunner series, and you might be considering getting either the Forerunner 970 or 570, and I think for the majority of you the 570 is more than good enough. The main thing I'm missing is that light here on top, but otherwise the experience for me in using the 570 has been basically identical to the 970. And today is actually my first 10k training run after being injured, so I'm quite excited to get to somewhat longer distances after being limited to relatively small distances for a while. So I'll also be taking the Garmin Forerunner 570 along and comparing its GPS tracking performance to a much more expensive watch, like for instance the Fenix 7 Pro. But I expect they will perform about the same. But I honestly don't expect a big difference between the two devices. Garmin is known for good GPS tracking, and I expect both will do quite well. But as you might notice by my eyes still needing to open up more, it's still early morning, so let's make a quick coffee. And I don't actually know if I'll eat something before going on my run, but a coffee is definitely needed. Okay, I just finished my 10k run. It was okay. I think I overdid it a little bit, so I felt my injury. Let's see how it feels tomorrow. But there's one thing I wanted to mention about the Forerunner 570, and that's that I at least had a lot of phantom clicks. And what do I mean by that is I looked at the watch and I saw it click through some menus, and sometimes it would just all of a sudden be in some menu, or I'd set an alarm that I hadn't set. I emailed my Garmin contact and I'll see if there's something wrong with my unit, or maybe it's the way I'm wearing it. Maybe something on my wrist is touching a button, but I've never had this, and I would be curious if any of you have experienced this. So if you've had any phantom clicks on your Garmin device, let me know in the comments below. I'm gonna walk a bit, do some stretching, and then we're gonna take a look at the data for the Garmin Forerunner 570. Is there anybody who dislikes stretching as much as I do? It really always feels like torture compared to the actual running. So the run was pretty decent overall, but one thing I noticed is there was quite some discrepancy between the distance measured by the Forerunner 570 and the distance measured by my Fenix 7 Pro. So I actually first want to look at those GPS tracks to see what's going on and just look at the overall quality. Then we're gonna hop back to the heart rate tracking performance, the sleep stage tracking, and we're also gonna look at the GPS tracking performance during cycling. But let's first take a look at these results because they have me a bit confused. And to start with, let's just look at the quality of the signals of the Forerunner 570 by itself, and then we'll compare it to the Fenix 7 Pro. And as always, I just ran in circles right here in the Belvedere Gardens for 10 kilometers. So we can see how well those signals overlap. So there's many circles that are almost identical. Once or twice I had to get out of the way of some people because it's also quite a touristy place. But overall I was able to mostly run the exact same circle. And you can see that all the signals are quite close together, which is really good. So that's what we'd hope to see. You would hope to see that the signals overlap very well, given that I ran the exact same circle multiple times. So overall looking pretty good. There are some minor deviations, but some of them will be real, some of them will not be real. Especially right here, there's one major deviation. I sometimes deviated a little bit, but I think never as much as this, but we'll see if the Fenix 7 Pro shows the same deviation. And then right here, we do see a bit more deviation between the lines than on the other side. And I actually see this quite often because right here, there's a bigger wall, which somehow seems to interfere with the GPS signals a bit more. So right here, we have really some of the best GPS tracking I've ever seen. The lines are super close together. And in this area, it's actually easier to run the exact same circle because there's sort of more of a corridor with bushes on both sides I have to run through. Whereas here I have more freedom. I try to run roughly in the middle of this track, but basically any deviation right here more than a meter is actual deviation in the GPS signal. In general, I have to say this is some of the best GPS tracking I've seen, so I'm super satisfied. But let's now compare this performance right here to the Fenix 7 Pro. So this is the Forerunner 570, and this right here is the result for the Fenix 7 Pro. And if we zoom in a bit, this actually looks a little bit worse, I would say. Interestingly, the signal is much smoother than we've seen before for some of the runs that I've done with the Fenix 7 Pro, even though it was still set to all systems plus multiband similar to the Forerunner 570. But there is definitely a bit more deviation in the signal, and we also have this major deviation right here. So I cannot really explain why the Fenix 7 Pro actually looks a little bit worse, in my opinion at least, than the Forerunner 570. It mostly looks quite okay, but there are some moments with more deviation, especially right here. But also if we compare this upper part right here to the result for the Forerunner 570, these are definitely clustered closer together. And there was also about a 300 meter distance difference between the Forerunner 570 and the Fenix 7 Pro on those 10 kilometers, where the Fenix 7 Pro recorded 300 fewer meters. So I'm not sure why exactly that happened and why actually the result for the Fenix 7 Pro looks a little bit worse. I'm not that content with it compared to what I've seen before for the most premium Garmin watches. I don't know if it could be that this sort of rubber thingy I put around it to protect it is somehow interfering with the signal. That's something I have to look into. But getting back to the Forerunner 570, which is the result right here, this is just really good GPS tracking. This is some of the best GPS tracking I've seen, so I'm super satisfied with that. But let's now move on from this to the heart rate tracking, because that is where Garmin sometimes struggles. And as always, we'll start with one of the easiest exercises for a device to track indoor cycling, and those results are right here. Where along the horizontal axis we have the reference device, which is the Polar H10 ECG chest strap, which can generally record my heart rate very accurately. So ECG is much more reliable than PPG, so the signal on the wrist to measure your heart rate. So this is the most reliable reference we can get. And the Garmin Forerunner 570, which uses PPG, so a signal on the wrist, on the vertical axis. And if they would perfectly agree, all measurements should be along this blue line right here. And overall, this probably is good enough. So in the higher heart rate range, it was super accurate, so almost all points are on the blue line. In the lower heart rate range, there's some deviations, sometimes detecting a too high and sometimes too low heart rate. And this likely means that in those dips in my heart rates in the intervals, it struggled a little bit. But we'll look at the 4 individual sessions that I did in a moment. First, I want to comment on the correlation, which is this R value up here, which is 0.93, which is pretty okay. I would like to see 0.95 or higher, so it cannot be higher than 1. And I use either 0.9 or 0.95 as a cutoff for being good enough for heart rate tracking during indoor cycling. And 0.93 is still pretty good and probably good enough. But let's take a look at the individual rides to see how good or bad these results actually are. And right here you can see the first spinning session with the Forerunner 570 in red and the Polar H10 in blue-green, so the reference device. And indeed, like I expected, in the higher heart rate range, it's super good. But in the lower heart rate range, and the dips in my heart rate, it struggles a little bit. So it doesn't fully detect all the dips in my heart rate. And sometimes there's some delay in picking up on an increase in heart rate. Still, for all intents and purposes, probably good enough. Also right here, we see some delays in picking up on changes in my heart rate. Otherwise, pretty good. Also, this session looks really good. And here also not much to complain about. There are still some better devices, but definitely good enough for most of us. But let's actually compare this performance to that of many other devices. And you can see that in this overview right here, where the correlation value we're looking at before is along the horizontal axis. And I ordered the watches from worst to best based on that correlation value along the vertical axis. That basically means the further to the right and the higher the device is, the better is its correlation with the reference device. And the Forerunner 570 is marked in red right here. And it's somewhere in the middle of all devices. Now, a lot of devices are getting to be good enough now. So the modern devices are actually quite decent at heart rate tracking for indoor cycling. And I would definitely say that this correlation for the Forerunner 570 is good enough based on what we just saw. However, let's see what devices it's close to. And to do that, we zoom in a bit. So these are just the devices with a correlation of 0.9 or higher. And you can actually see that the Forerunner 570 is super close to the Forerunner 970, basically the same performance, actually also very close to the Forerunner 165, the Venue 3, the Enduro 3, the Instinct 3, the Forerunner 965. All these Garmin devices perform the same on me, and they're in sort of the second or third tier of devices. Which devices are better? Well, we have, for instance, different Apple Watches and the Pixel Watch 3, which are the absolute best devices out there. Also, some Huawei devices aren't bad. So those are the first tier devices. And in the second tier of devices, we have, for instance, the Whoop strap worn on the biceps, which is one of my favorite overall devices, which is pretty good at heart rate tracking, pretty good at sleep stage tracking, and it has an amazing app. The downside of the Whoop strap is that it has a mandatory subscription service, whereas Garmin now has sort of an optional subscription service, which I don't like that they introduced. It somehow seems un-Garmin-like, but it is what it is. But for Whoop, you pay every month. So that's something that's not for everyone. Even though I personally use it myself, I understand it's not something everyone wants. If you do end up wanting to get yourself a Whoop strap and you want the best deal possible, you can use my affiliate link up here or down here, and you'll be supporting the channel at the same time. However, as I said, it is a subscription. You don't pay anything for the device, but you just pay every month to use the device. But getting back to the Forerunner 570, I do think it's good enough for indoor cycling, at least based on my testing. But let's now make things more difficult, and let's take a look at the exercise most of you will be using the Forerunner for, which is running. And these results are also really good. I'm quite happy with them. Most points are on or close to the blue line. There was 1 or 2 moments of deviation, but quite minor. And the correlation is really high at 0.97. Again, there are a few devices that are better, but this looks good enough for me. But let's take a look at the runs themselves. So here we have the first run where I had more or less a continuous run, so no intervals. And this looks perfect, nothing to complain about here. This second run is mostly perfect. There was 1 moment where a peak in heart rate wasn't detected. And for both these, there was actually a delay in picking up on my increased heart rate here in the beginning, but nothing much to complain about. And also this last session looks quite good, though here we see those 2 moments of deviation. One was right here, where I didn't fully detect those changes right here. And also here there was a slight delay in picking up on a decrease in my heart rate. But this is honestly, again, good enough and probably even just good. So I'm quite happy with these results. And if we compare them to the competition, we can indeed see that. So that's in this overview right here, where again, we want the devices to be as far to the top right as possible. And the Forerunner 570 is among some of the better devices right here. It's actually close to some other Garmin devices, so let's zoom in a bit. And that zoomed in view is displayed right here. Again, these are just the devices with a correlation of 0.9 or higher. And we can see that the Garmin Forerunner 570 is close to the Forerunner 165, the Forerunner 970 that I recently reviewed, and also not that far, for instance, from the Venue 3. This is sort of where I would expect it to be, and it's doing really well, and I'm quite happy with those results. The only devices that are doing better in my testing are different Apple Watches, also the Whoop strap when worn on the biceps, and some Amazfit devices are also quite good at heart rate tracking, and they're really a little bit more affordable than, for instance, the Garmin Forerunner 570. I do think the ecosystem of Garmin is more attractive in that sense. So I use a Garmin myself for my runs because I just trust the GPS tracking. I like the ecosystem. But out of all devices at the moment, the Forerunner 570 is my favorite if I'm also considering the price. Given that I have a 970, I might actually sometimes take that with me on a run. But I really love my 570 as well. And the testing so far has been quite good, especially for running and indoor cycling. But let's now make things a lot more difficult, and let's take a look at the results for cycling. And with cycling, I actually mean biking outside, so I did about 20 rides or so with the Forerunner 570. And we get a correlation of 0.89, which is okay, though definitely at the border of being not good enough anymore. So we see quite a few points here below the blue line. This probably means that for some of my sort of intervals, because I, for instance, have to stop at traffic lights, during some of those intervals, I just wasn't able to detect that increase in heart rate immediately again. But let's take a look at some of those bike rides to see what's going on. And indeed, they look as I expected. So mostly the heart rate tracking is quite good. So the red line overlaps quite well with the blue-green line. But then sometimes when I have to stop in front of a traffic light and my heart rate drops, the Garmin Forerunner 570 doesn't fully detect that drop and then has a delay in picking up on that increase. We also see that for several of the segments right here. The same for this one right here, where it even missed some of the peaks in my heart rate. This longer road bike ride actually looks quite good. This bike ride again isn't perfect. Also this one not. Here we see a big deviation, so this one is really not good. This one is also far from perfect. For the longer road bike rides like this one right here, it looks a bit better. And I suspect this has to do with the positioning of my wrist potentially. So when I'm road biking, my hands are mostly in this kind of position. I don't know if you can see this. So where they're mostly in a somewhat more relaxed position, either on top or on the drop. And on my normal city bike, which I use for a lot of my shorter rides, my hands are more like this, where there's maybe more tension on the wrist and it's more twisted, where a neutral position is more like this. So that could be one explanation for why it seems to do a little bit better for those longer rides than the shorter rides. Though even for this longer ride, for instance right here, we can see it miss some of the peaks in my heart rate. So overall, quite okay performance, where on the longer rides, it looks a little bit better than for the shorter rides. Though there's also definitely some imperfections right here. Still, many of you will likely use it for those longer road bike rides, I suspect, where maybe the hands are in a more favorable position for measuring your heart rate accurately. And still also for those shorter rides, sometimes it's quite okay. And I know that many watches struggle on me. Somehow my physiology makes it harder to measure my heart rate on the wrist, which is good for testing because we get a harder use case and we can better discriminate between the really good heart rate trackers and the not so good heart rate trackers. But that also means that sometimes I might be a bit harsher on a product than I actually need to be. But this is just how it performs on me. In the future, I also want to test on more people, and I'm already testing also on my colleague Raphael a bunch of watches. But I still have to set up a system for getting more people involved, and that also costs some money and time. And talking about money and time, if you want to support this channel and help me keep it viable to keep paying my editor Alex and buying all of these products, like the Forerunner 570, which I bought with my own money, and of course also the editing is paid for and everything, you can directly financially support the channel by becoming a YouTube member, which gives you early access to a bunch of my videos. It's basically like Patreon on YouTube. That's honestly the best way of directly supporting the channel. However, of course, there's other ways of supporting as well. Just liking, subscribing, and commenting already really help. Or use one of my affiliate links in the description below if you buy anything on Amazon at all, but first click on my link that already supports the channel because I get a small commission from that. Or if you're into running, which I suspect you are because you're watching a video on the Garmin Forerunner 570, you might want to check out the Runner app, which is my favorite app for planning my runs and getting live coaching during my runs. And it directly connects to watches like your Forerunner 570 or another Garmin device. So it makes your running plan for you, whether you're training for a marathon, a half marathon, a 10K, a 5K, and then during the run gives you your pacing and gives you guidance on whether to go faster or slower. As a cyclist, this has been a game changer for my running game. So if you want to check that out and get the best deal possible with a 2-week free trial, use my affiliate link up here or down here. But let's get back to the cycling results and let's see how these compare to that of many other devices. And here we actually see that the Forerunner 570 isn't terrible compared to the competition. It's not amongst the best devices up here, but it's sort of in the upper middle class of devices. But let's zoom in a bit so we can read those labels better. And in that zoomed in view with just some of the better devices of a correlation of 0.8 or higher, we can again see it basically performs similarly to the Forerunner 970, but also other newer Garmin devices like the Instinct 3, for instance, aren't that far off. So it's really where we expect it to be, and again, no different from the Forerunner 970, which again for me solidifies that for most people, the 570 will be good enough, and you probably don't need to spend that extra money on the 970 unless you just want to treat yourself with a slightly better watch, which has, for instance, a light on it and some other small differences. Overall, though, I would be happy enough with the 570. And again, some of the best devices out there are different Apple Watches, but also, for instance, the Pixel Watch 3 and different Huawei devices. And finally, the hardest exercise out there for a watch to track is weightlifting. And we can also see that in the results of the Forerunner 570, where it has a quite low correlation at 0.79. And there's many points below the blue line, especially in the higher heart rate range. And regular viewers will know what that means. Basically, the moment I start a set of exercises and there's a lot of tension on my wrist, the Forerunner 570 just cannot detect my heart rate accurately. The tension just makes it impossible for it to measure the blood flow changes accurately. But let's take a look at those individual weightlifting sessions. And indeed, as I suspected, each time I have a peak in my heart rate, the Forerunner 570 in red just isn't able to keep up with my actual heart rate. So all of the peaks are missed right here. Also here, just some of the peaks are partially detected. This session also, most peaks are missed, and the same is true for this last session I want to share with you. Basically, for weightlifting, don't use the Forerunner 570 or any Garmin device or basically any smartwatch out there except for potentially the Apple Watch. And you can see that in this overview right here. Only Apple Watches and the Powerbeats Pro 2, which are basically headphones that go in your ear and measure your heart rate there, consistently have a correlation above 0.95. Now, Apple Watches do sometimes have a dropout on your heart rate, so the moment it cannot get a reliable signal, it will just stop measuring your heart rate, so you'll never get a false measurement, but you'll have missing measurements. Honestly, if you want to track your heart rate during weightlifting, just use an ECG chest strap or potentially use the Powerbeats Pro 2. Okay, so those are the results for heart rate tracking and an initial GPS tracking test. For GPS tracking, Garmin definitely has some of the best performance out there, and the Forerunner 570 is no exception. So I definitely recommend it so far for GPS tracking, but in a moment we'll also do another test for cycling. Heart rate tracking was actually pretty decent. For cycling outside, it's sort of on the border of being good enough, but generally I'm not that disappointed. I think for my longer bike rides, it's sort of okay, especially if I go with my road bike. With my city bike, maybe because of the position of my wrist, I'm not sure, it definitely struggled a bit more. But one other important thing for me is my recovery and my sleep. And this is something that Garmin has historically not been great at least for the sleep stage tracking. So getting an estimate of your total amount of deep sleep, REM sleep, and also your light sleep. Somehow there, the algorithm of Garmin is still kind of underperforming compared to much of the competition. But let's see if this is also the case for the Garmin Forerunner 570. And the way we'll test that is by comparing the Garmin Forerunner 570 against the Z-Max EEG headband, which is used in scientific studies and has specifically been designed for sleep stage tracking. It can actually measure my brain waves, and I then use some computer code to convert those brain waves to sleep stages. So let's see how the sleep stages as measured by the Z-Max EEG headband compared to the Garmin Forerunner 570, but for that of course we'll go back to my computer. And here we have those results for the sleep stage tracking performance. But if we look at this overview right here, it's more or less as we're used to from Garmin. So we have the sleep stages as measured by the reference device on top, and those measured according to the Garmin Forerunner 570 on the left. And if they would perfectly agree, all values on this diagonal should be 100%. And we're going to ignore this awake column, because in general, the Z-Max EEG device detects a lot of short awake moments that aren't really awake moments, so I don't want to misinterpret that. So we're just going to focus on the actual sleep stages of deep sleep, light sleep, and REM sleep. Now, first of all, we see that about 86% of what the reference device said was deep sleep was also detected as deep sleep by the Forerunner 570, so that's pretty good. However, only 61% of what was light sleep according to the reference device was also light sleep according to the 570. So that's already quite a bit lower, and a lot of it was instead predicted as being deep sleep. So a lot of extra deep sleep was detected by the Forerunner 570. And REM sleep is by far the worst. Only about 37% of what was REM sleep according to the reference device was also REM sleep according to the 570. And this we know from Garmin. They're just not good at REM sleep tracking. The REM sleep is just all over the place. So what I think is a first beat algorithm just doesn't work very well. And we can actually compare this to the competition and see how different it is from other Garmin devices. And regular viewers will be familiar with this kind of overview, where the further to the top right the device is, the better is its agreement with the reference device, where we have the average agreement along the horizontal axis and the agreement of the worst sleep stage along the vertical axis. And all devices marked in green were tested against the Z-Max EEG headband, so the same reference we used in this video. And we can find the Garmin Forerunner 570 right here. So it's really not that bad in terms of average agreement, it's somewhere in the middle of all devices. But because the REM sleep tracking is so bad, it's quite low on this other axis right here. And it's super close to a lot of other Garmin devices I tested recently, like the Venue X1 right here, but also the Enduro 3, the Vivo Active 5, the Forerunner 970, the Instinct 3, and even the Vivo Active 6. So all these devices right here from Garmin are having the same sleep stage tracking performance. There might be some outliers sometimes, like the Venue 3 here, which seems to do a little bit better. But probably this is more or less a fluke result where I might not have enough data or I was sleeping a little bit aberrant from normal. Still, they're all somewhere in the middle of all devices right here. And they're just not as good as some of the top performers out there. Now, the top 4 brands are 8 Sleep, Apple, Aura, and Sleep 2 or Nukua. And sort of the second tier still good enough devices in my opinion are different Fitbit and Google devices, so the different Fitbits, but also Pixel Watch 2 and 3, etc. And also the Whoop strap is pretty decent at sleep stage tracking, though not quite as good as these top devices right here. So my favorite overall device for sleep tracking is the 8 Sleep Pod. And that's because it doesn't just track, it actually actively improves my sleep quality. So the 8 Sleep Pod is not something you wear in your body, but it goes around your mattress and can actively heat and cool each 2 sides of the bed independently. And I'm a quite hot sleeper, so I have trouble cooling down. So I just set my temperature a bit lower. And when I have a partner, which I don't have at the moment, but when I do, she can set her side of the bed independently at a different temperature. And it will actually change throughout the night if you want. So for instance, when you're in deep sleep, you can be cooled a bit more. And for me, this is just a game changer, especially in summer, but even in winter, I just suffer when I sleep too hot. And now even the blanket is cooled. So both from the top and the bottom, you're cooled. And this is just amazing for me. This is the only reason I still sleep on these hot summer nights here in Vienna. And in addition, it tracks things like your heart rate variability, and a bunch of other things without having to wear anything on your body. And it's super reliable also for sleep stages. But it's super expensive, so don't feel like you have to have this device. It's nice to have when you can afford it, but there's also other ways of cooling down before bed, like taking a hot shower before bed already helps a bit. But for me, I'm lucky enough to be able to use the device, and it's really changed my sleep. Though I now suffer a bit when I'm in a hotel room, for instance, and I don't have this opportunity. If you want to get the best deal possible on the 8 Sleep and make it a little bit more affordable, you can get the best discount possible with my affiliate link up here or down here, and you'll be supporting the channel at the same time. But getting back to Garmin, I think all Garmin devices are okay-ish at sleep stage tracking, but they will definitely get your REM sleep wrong. At least based on my testing, this is my overall conclusion. And I actually made a video a while ago based on all scientific literature, and it was clear that Garmin wasn't a great sleep stage tracker, also when tested on a bunch of other people. Okay, so that was the sleep stage tracking performance, which is basically what we expected from Garmin. It's just not very good. Then again, how many of you actually care about this? I think most people looking to buy a Forerunner want accurate GPS tracking, which the device does have. At least that's what it seems like based on that run that I did. But what about cycling? Is it also good for that? Well, to test that, I cycled the exact same route several times. So now I didn't cycle in circles, but I just cycled to work and back a bunch of times. And if the GPS signals overlap very well there, then I also think the GPS tracking is overall very good. But maybe it struggled a little bit more for cycling because of course the speed is a lot higher. So let's take a look now at the GPS tracking results for cycling. And if this is also good, then I would recommend the Garmin Forerunner 570 for quite a few people. However, if you also want to track your heart rate during those bike rides, then I actually might suggest also getting an ECG chest strap to go with it, because there the Garmin Forerunner 570 still seems to struggle. But overall, I just really like the Garmin ecosystem for my sports. So let's take a look. And here we have those results. Let's start for 7 times I cycled to work, and I always start my ride on the corner ride here. And we can at least see that the signals are acquired really quickly and that they're pretty close to this corner. So this is already looking pretty good. But let's now see how consistent the signals actually are. So how well do the blue lines overlap? And that looks pretty okay in the beginning. One signal is all over the place here. It probably still needs a bit of time to get a more accurate signal. Still some deviation right here, and then right here it's starting to look super consistent. So this is really good. Going along the ride, looking okay, though here we definitely have some more deviation. Here looking really good, also looking really good. Some minor deviation right here. This is looking super good. Here also very consistent, though these 2 lines are a bit further away. Then right here we have pretty consistent signals, and right here it looks really good. So super consistent right here. Then staying really good. So it took some time to acquire the signal more accurately, but then it's looking really good. Here I actually took a different route. So this is not a deviation, but an actual different route. Here looking really good. Then right here we do see some more deviation. And I've seen this before, especially for some Garmin devices. I think, I'm not sure, maybe because there's more taller buildings right here. But for some reason it struggles a little bit in this area, and then looking really good. Okay, so far looking pretty good, but it did struggle a little bit here in the beginning. So right here in the very beginning, Was it not really perfect? But overall, if you look at the ride as an entirety, it's looking really good. Yes, it's not absolutely perfect, but it's some of the best performance we've seen for any brand out there. But I actually also cycled back from work. So we have sort of a second test to look at. So we can see if it's consistent or if we actually see bigger deviations there. Because in some parts of the ride there, it actually struggles. And here we have the results for 7 times I cycled back from work. And you can see that the signals were acquired quite quickly again. So all points are in roughly the same area. One time I actually started from somewhere else, so right here. But basically again, the signal is acquired almost instantly, which is good. But let's now take a look at the consistency between them. So there's a bit of deviation here in the beginning, but then quite quickly it starts to look really good. Here the signals are super close together, so looking quite good. Still looking really good. Maybe a bit of deviation for this one signal right here. Overall here looking quite good. Some devices seem to struggle already right here, and then near the roundabout sometimes there's also some deviation. Still looking really good, honestly. One time a bit of deviation right here and also right here. Otherwise looking really good. Here at first I thought it was not looking so good, but there was actually construction at some point. So I had to go beneath some structures right here, which I normally don't go to. So it would actually lose the GPS signal potentially. So let's ignore this part right here because I wasn't even cycling but had to walk here. So let's move on to a little bit further. There was actually also some construction still right here. So it was moving along the route over time. So only right here can we say confidently again that I was cycling. And there the results are super consistent, so looking really good. Also looking good right here. A bit of deviation right here, though potentially again there was some construction here where I couldn't cycle on this side of the road. I actually think this is the case right here, which is why these are also splitting up. In summer in Vienna there appears to be a lot of roadworks. But then right here there's no construction. We do have some deviation right here, which is actual deviation. Then here generally looking quite good with one signal doing a bit of a weird loop right here. Overall though, the signals are still really close together. I'm quite happy with this. Looking really good. Honestly, this confirms mostly what we've seen before. This is some of the best GPS tracking performance I've seen from any device out there. Garmin is the main brand at the moment that I would trust in terms of my runs and my rides. And the fact that the Forerunner 570 also shows really good GPS tracking performance makes me want to recommend this device even more to people. I do like the Garmin Forerunner 970 a bit more, especially because the 970 has that light on it. However, it's not worth the extra money for me unless you have a bunch of money to spend. I don't think the upgrade is worth it for the majority of people. Yes, there are some minor differences, but I think they're relatively minor. But now I want to give you my overall conclusions. Okay, overall conclusion on the Garmin Forerunner 570. From an objective perspective, I think the heart rate tracking is likely good enough for many of you. So in that sense, unless you want to use it for outdoor cycling, I can recommend it for quite a few of you. Unless you want the absolute best heart rate tracking out there, then the Garmin Forerunner 570 probably isn't the device for you. However, also from a subjective experience in using the Garmin Forerunner 570, I just really like the device. It's just a nice experience, a nice screen, a nice app, and especially for sports, GPS tracking performance is quite important for me, and that's where Garmin shines. And the Garmin 570 is no exception. As I said, I do like the 970 a bit better, but the difference is so minor that I don't think it's worth the extra money. Now, in terms of health tracking, that's where Garmin still has to improve, especially when it comes to sleep stage tracking. This just isn't as good as some of the competition. So for instance, H-Sleep, Aura, Apple and Nukua, and even Whoop and Fitbit/Google are all doing better than Garmin. So this is one aspect where Garmin still has to invest some effort and money, but of course it isn't their core business. Their core business is more sports and GPS, especially for something like a Forerunner. So I sort of understand it, though I'm still a bit sad that such a major company doesn't invest the effort and the money to improve this. So who is the Garmin Forerunner 570 actually for? Let me put you down for a second. I think it's people who take their running reasonably serious but don't want to spend that extra money on, for instance, the 970, but also don't want the cheapest in the Garmin lineup. Honestly, I think a Forerunner 165 for instance is already good enough for many of you out there, but it is a slightly less premium experience. And honestly, me, myself, at this phase in my life, where I have some disposable income and I take my sports relatively serious, I would go for the 570 for my sports. However, the health tracking there is lacking. And if I only wanted a single device and health tracking was also important, then I just wouldn't get a Garmin device. Instead, I would, for instance, get a Whoop strap, which is my favorite overall device for health, sports, sleep, all those things with an amazing app. If it was purely focused on health, then I would get an Oura ring, which is really good at sleep tracking, sleep stage tracking, all those things, but it's just not that suitable for sports. Luckily, I'm in the position where I can use several devices for several purposes. So I use my H-Sleep for the sleep tracking and for the sleep improvement. Then if I'm traveling, I also use my Oura ring because I can use it anywhere. And if you're traveling a lot, of course, you cannot take your H-Sleep with you. Then as an overall device for both sleep and sports, but a device which isn't the best at either of the two, I use the Whoop strap. As I said, it's my overall device that I use for everything. However, the Oura ring is just slightly better for sleep, and several other devices are better for heart rate tracking, for instance. But on the other hand, the Whoop strap has an amazing app that goes with it, so data interpretation there is a lot easier. And then finally, I use the Garmin ecosystem to track my sports in more detail. So I have a smart trainer, which is connected to a Garmin cycling computer, which is also connected to a Garmin heart rate monitor. And then if I go on a run, I take a Garmin watch with me. Of course, I could also connect my Garmin watches to, for instance, my smart trainer. So if I could only have a single device for sports, I would get a Garmin and probably something like a Forerunner 570, like I said, or maybe a Phoenix 7 Pro, which is now quite a lot cheaper, and you can also connect it to your smart trainer. So that's my overall setup and who I'd recommend the different devices to. It's really up to you what device you want, which suits your purposes the best. Now, if you do end up getting a Forerunner 570, a Galaxy Watch maybe, an Oura ring, a Whoop strap, an H-Sleep pod, another device, or anything at all on Amazon for that matter, even something as small as toilet paper, you want to save a bunch of money and support the channel at the same time. There are different affiliate links in the description below that often give you a great discount or at least don't cost you any extra and at the same time support the channel. Now, given that you watched this whole video on the Garmin Forerunner 570, check out this video on the 970 or this video on the best sleep stage trackers.